I'm sorry, I don't know how to speak without images. So, that's what happens to art historians after a few years. They just can't do it. So, so what I would like to present to you today is my project with the IMéRA Mucem, but also a little bit how I got there, and so that you get to know also a little bit more about what I do for research and the kinds of things that interest me. So there's a lot of text on the slides. You can ignore them. They're more for me to kind of remember to tell you important stuff than to actually read. But what I thought I would start with was to explain to you a little bit where I'm coming from and what I've been working on, what I've been thinking about over the last few years. I have several areas of specialty, which is often a little bit confusing for people. One of them is museum studies, and another one of them is word and image. But somehow you'll see they connect quite closely. And so this is the kinds of things I had been working on in terms of museum studies. Things that have to do with participatory practices in museums, which are very popular everywhere in Europe and that are starting to become more and more popular in France. About narrative theories, problems of exhibition strategy, and also problems of agency and participation in museums. So it's a lot to do with how museums try to engage audiences in a different way and how they try to adapt to this new role that has been kind of that is more and more imposed to museum to convey multi-voices, to convey more than the authority, the authoritative narrative from art history. So that's what I was doing in museum studies, and then since I started working a couple of years ago in Amsterdam, I started working more and more on word and image because I hold a special chair there that's really focused on word and image. And I had been doing that for years, but what interested me particularly was the way in which illustration was shaping the identity of audiences. And so, of course, those kind of areas of studies kind of came together in the project that I proposed for the Mucem. And when I saw the call for projects, I thought that I would manage to put together several aspects of my research, some that have to do with narrative, some that have to do with multimodal exhibition strategies, so the various ways in which stories are being told, and what has to do with identity formation. So I started with a research question that was very much based on the idea of the Mucem as a societal museum, as a multidisciplinary space, but also as a holder of Mediterranean narratives. And we'll see that has become gradually an issue when I was starting to set the work together. But the idea was very much to look at how the narratives are communicated in the museums and how the narratives that are fed by all kinds of research area actually impact on the identity of the visitors and the way in which they understand what it means to be from the Mediterranean. So I started by proposing a first proposal that really was very nice and tidy, where I would look at the narrative, analyze the narrative, look at the impact on visitors, then design new multimodal communication tool, and then pilot specific new tools embedded in the exhibition space to try and see how efficient we could be at passing on these narratives. And then real life happened. Because, of course, when you work with an institution like the Mucem, you need a specific type of collaboration. First, you need the curatorial and the educational audience departments to collaborate quite closely, which is actually quite rare in French museums. It's something that happens in the Netherlands much more organically because of the structure of the museums, but not so much in France. There was, of course, potential issues of implementation with the planning of the museums, because most museums have their planning done 2 years in advance, so it's quite difficult as a researcher to arrive and say, hey, I would like to do something in your exhibition space. And the language of research, which actually turned out to be the main issue, because some key concepts like participation, co-creation, identity, narratives are very well defined in English, but those definitions are actually different in the French environment, and those terms come with various unsaid value, and we'll see that that's was a problem. So I wrote an extended proposal, and I thought I'm going to go and meet with them, and we will talk about it, and we'll see what we can do. Which was actually, thank God for Yolande to organize all this in October, because otherwise we would be starting just now. So I actually had 3 meetings. The first one was with the curators and the research director, where they presented to me the structure of the museum, where they explained the collections and the issue that they actually have with that name of the Museum of Mediterranean and European Civilization, because they see themselves as a global museum. So already we can see that that was going to be an issue for the kinds of research that I wanted to do. And we hit a wall with the term identity. There was, in a French environment, in a French museum environment, the term identity is very much perceived as a political term, which of course, for an Anglo-Saxon environment, it really isn't. It's a social term, but it's not a political term. So there was a very interesting backlash to all this. So we started thinking about how we can find a common ground. And I had a second museum with the head of audience department, where we actually discussed the timeline, and some solutions started already emerging. And I then spent a third day in a participatory workshop that was organized to prepare the exhibition about AIDS. And there really some potential solution emerged. Because during that workshop day, what happened is that I saw there was a real interest for participatory practices, and as I told you, that's something that I've been working on quite a lot. You could see that there was also institutional tensions, disjunction between the different departments in the way they understood participation. You could see also that there was a will for an exploratory process and a will to explore and give voice. And of course, it's a great topic for these kinds of things, because you really need the multi-voice for it to work. There were some ideas around agency and identity that were really interesting, because you have a group of people that are mostly activists, that are arriving already with very strong voice, very strong positions, and that really want to change the way in which the museum communicates around their own stories. So the issues of authority are very interesting. There's this idea of the lived history. Then there was also something just very practical about the exhibition design timeline. They are working towards an exhibition list of objects for June, which means that if I want to experiment with some multimodal means of exhibition, I can actually suggest them. I will not be able to test them, but at least I'm able to have an impact there. And the group is really willing to be observed, so they are very aware that what they're doing is actually not a common thing to do. So there's really a potential for collaboration research. So I proposed a revised proposal. You see, I've been busy for someone that's been here just 2 weeks. Huh? So I proposed a revised proposal where I split the research in 2 parts to address really the existing split in the institution between the audience and the curatorial teams, and also to the timeline issue. The fact that I couldn't do audience research on something, I would be testing myself because of the timeline of the institution. And I started reworking the theoretical framework to address concerns around identity, collection issues, the global museum, so things that were not really on my radar because I was so focused on this idea of the Mediterranean narrative. And then I started reworking the methodology, and that's still something I'm working on. So I will not go through everything here. I just want to show you a little bit how I split the project and what I'm actually going to do. So the first kind of part is around participatory practice and multimodal tools, and is really centered around the AIDS exhibition. And the first kind of aspect is really about participatory practice. As I said, there was a real interest from the Mucem to explore what participatory practices mean, but and what's their role for as a museum as co-builder of societal and historical narrative, and how they can also impact on the identity of and the sense of belonging of the participants. So I thought that was something that we can really work from. And the Mucem has already started a reflection group, an internal reflection group on participation, and what we're thinking about doing is expand that reflection group to other French museums. So we're starting to explore to see how we can do that, and the idea would be to create a handbook with what you can learn from participatory practice and how you can do participatory practices in a better in a better way, because there are a lot of issues around participatory practices that need to be solved. The second aspect of that first part is around multimodal tool design. So, as I said, within the existing schedule of the exhibition, there is a cahier des charges de la scénographie that has to be planned for 2020, for June 2020, which means that that's really where I can play a little bit. And what's really interesting to me is the way we will. The multi-voice narrative can come through in the exhibition, because that's one of the things that's really interesting about that exhibition is they have a group of about 30 people that are working on the co-creation of the exhibition. So on my scale, it's an enormous group. And they all have very individual stories, but they also all have kind of a general narrative. And they're trying to, they want to exhibit that diversity. And that's something that I find actually first fascinating as a group. I think they're negotiating this in a very interesting way. And this tension between the personal and the general is something that they want to show in the exhibition. So I think that will be really where the multimodal tool design can come in. The second part will be about the evaluation of the impact on audiences of an existing multimodal narrative in the museum. And I've decided to work on the exhibition connectivity, because it is supposed to be about the Mediterranean stories. So that suits quite well my original interest. And the aim is really to evaluate the impact on audiences of those different narratives of this exhibition space. And so that's really the part of my work where I will work more with the audience department, and we started working together already. And so there is the idea is really to try and come up with a set of recommendations. On the side of all this, which is really the kind of official kind of gathering of data, I still want to work on this idea of Mediterranean identity, because I think that there is something to be done in France at the moment, and maybe in French, about identity and matters of community belonging, and what it means to be a Mediterranean identity museum, Mediterranean civilization museum in a global world, and how the complexity of it, but also how it can be depoliticized to allow them to embrace that social role that the societal museum should be having. So what now? Well, I'm working on my revised theoretical framework and revised methodology. I really like the Lego academics, so I usually always end up having them in my presentations. And so basically, instead of working solely on museum narratives and identity, I'm looking more at this kind of reception, museum and narrative, and participation as a mode of production of those narratives. So what are the potential issues that I might have? And that's the one that I'm kind of working on at the moment. The first one is shared data, because there's a lot of researchers in Mucem that are actually working on those matters at the moment. So we're looking at what data is being collected, who's using what, and what do we want to do with those data, how we can share data in a as efficient way as possible. Access for part 2, because the first contact with the audience department was very open, and it's gradually closing, and we probably should talk about that. So there is something here that we need to ongoingly negotiate, I think, in terms of access. And the matter of identity, as I said, which I find fascinating, because I arrived very naively in that meeting, I think, back in October. So I'm getting ready for field work, and I'm starting already this week with interviews and starting to gather some soft data to kind of get the landscape in place. So that's what I'm doing at the IMéRA. If there's any questions.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
They're not artists, and that's where it becomes interesting, that they're not creating artworks, but they're creating narratives. And then the museum itself is choosing objects along with the participants. So the participants themselves are choosing objects, are choosing artworks in order to tell those stories. And I find that a really interesting kind of process, where they keep regular people, non-artists, as really builders of the narrative.
It's like they are building the attention.
Yeah, and they are in charge. And it's been very interesting in terms of authority and the way in which authority is being negotiated. For example, our last workshop, there was an intense moment where one of the participants asked, so when is the censorship police coming in? And we were just like, well, there is no such thing. You just, it's your exhibition. You have to tell what you want to say. But there was a really interesting discussion around, okay, they're really suspicious about this. They think this is really weird, that they're being allowed to tell their story. So, yeah, it's an interesting, really interesting case in terms of authority and power. Any other questions?
Yeah, I don't know.
I'd like to ask about the concept of identity. Because, identity may include religion, nationality, place, language. But now, when we speak about identity, we speak about, choose and pick. And you can now with the globalization, people are not stick to the traditional way of identity. People now, when I came to Marseille here for several weeks, and I find myself sharing many aspects with people who live in Marseille. Without any problem.
Yeah, and I think that's the...
Although I don't speak the language.
No.
French, but I
You speak Arabic, no?
It's enough.
No, but I think what's important to understand about identity is that you have that personal identity and you have that social identity. And I think, I do recommend if you want to read something interesting about identity, Heinrich has just published a book, I think last year, about what identity is not, which I thought was a really good starting point, start of conversation also, I understand. But I think it's not about building identity in terms of or. You're not this or that, but and. So by now, you're and Marseillais, right? So I think it's about building this idea of identity as a layered accumulation of identity rather than an exclusionary logic.
So you can change your identity.
Of course, and identity changed throughout life. Jesus, I'm not the little girl I was when I was 12, thank God. I'm just thankful that but do you see what I mean? Like there is an evolution and there is an accumulation. And it's something that I find, well, I've also lived in many places, so I have I have a very strong sense of this accumulation of identity that I think is actually much more common than what people want to define. But that's something I would be very interested to talk more about with you, because I think that it's time for a new model of identity, indeed, because of the global environment in which we are.
I'm just puzzled by this, just a quite broader question about this participatory stuff.
Yeah.
Because for example, last year we had a similar thing with a group which was presented by Juillet, by the way. So it was about participatory theater, people asking people to, attendees to participate. This seems to be the same here. And even I can extrapolate with the previous presentation of actually it's the participation of citizens in the elaboration of constitutions or the like. So, of course, depending on the area, we don't expect the modus operandi are not the same and the objectives are different. So, what should be the specificity of the participatory schemes in your area?
Well, the thing is that participation itself already within the area has many definitions, and it's been one of the problems. Even within a museum, the marketing department will count participation as attendance, which the education department will say there's no way.
Yeah, but you can tell us when did this story started and experiences in other places?
Yes, there is a lot of experience in other places.
When did it start?
So, well, it's something that I not new from the Eco Museum already in the 70s and 80s. You already have some participatory practices in museum. What's interesting now is the way in which, and I think the whole discussion about the definition of what a museum is, that has been, I don't know if you followed in ICOM, there's been a lot of debate about what a museum is from a very traditional definition of a museum being, about collections and kind of communication, research, to becoming a social agent, to becoming something that actually has an impact on society and on the way in which society understands itself. And I think that within that kind of broader, that shift of the role of the museum, participatory practices are becoming more important, and I think that that's why there is more and more discussion around it. But in terms of defining it for my own field, I will get crucified by any kind of other people in my area by putting down definitions. And I actually wrote a book chapter 2 years ago with a colleague mapping the different kind of understanding of participation within different fields, just within the museum field already. So that's something that's actually still being developed. And what's interesting is that a lot of the publications we have at the moment are very much case study based. They're just showing what that case study is doing, and what we're lacking is modelization. And that's also what I would like to try and do when I'm here, is try to start a modelization system.
I'm just saying that it's the first time I hear about this in museums. But maybe
in France, it's quite
rare. Already, vous avez déjà eu des expériences comme ça au lycée?
Le foot, un petit peu foot déjà.
Oui, sur une ou deux préparations d'exposition, on a posé ces questions de participation et d'association des gens qui pouvaient en parler. Donc c'est le cas avec Emilie Sitzia et puis on prépare une exposition sur les Roms qui va aussi fonctionner comme ça. On a eu un workshop dans le cadre d'un projet européen sur la question de l'autorité partagée, où on avait essayé de mettre en question le partage de l'autorité dans les différentes fonctions du musée, l'activité du musée. C'est des questions qui sont au cœur d'un certain nombre de professionnels du musée, pas tous, et la présence d'Emilie va certainement aider à fédérer à l'intérieur de Mucem une série de